Hey guys, SuperHorrorBro Mike here, and in today's Bendy and the Ink Machine video, we take a look at the story of Joey Drew. Joey has been a key character throughout the story of Bendy and the Ink Machine, despite the fact we never actually saw or interacted with him until the final moments of the game. Instead, Mr. Drew remained something of a mystery, referenced by characters here and there throughout the game's 5 chapters, and on occasion popped up to weigh in himself via monologues on these audio tapes. However, the story now has an ending, and for now at least, we have all the information we are likely to get in relation to Joey as a character and the building of his crooked empire that led to the eventual dabbling into human experimentation and the construction of the Ink Machine. With this in mind, I wanted to put together a video which compiled all of this information and told the story of Joey Drew and how I personally believed things went down at the old workshop, leading to Henry's eventual re-involvement with Joey and his tragic imprisonment within his twisted cartoon world. This is part 1 of a 2-part video, in which we will look at the early years where we look at how 2 friends, Joey and Henry, started up an animation studio, and the eventual catalyst that led Henry to finally turn his back on it all. The events that transpired after Henry left and the dark path Joey took chasing his dreams. Then in part 2 we will look at how Joey partnered with a gent company to create the Ink Machine, and years later how this led Henry to become re-involved with his nefarious plans. By looking at these points, we should have a clear picture of how events transpired and how Joey became corrupted by his own success and failures over the years. So let us start by rewinding to the very beginning of this strange story, where 2 friends first embarked on the creation of something wonderful. Now quickly, I want to give my personal theory as to how Joey and Henry may have met. I believe these 2 friends first became acquainted during the war, more specifically during World War I. We know that the cartoons Henry and Joey worked on together were during the golden era of animation, which took place during the 1930s, and as World War II started in 1939 and ended in 1945, it would mean it was impossible for the 2 to be involved in this conflict directly. However, we do see the message "Buy bonds" on many of the Bendy posters found around the studio, which suggests both Joey and Henry were patriots who were involved in the war effort, and this is likely because they both once served together in the armed forces during World War I as young men themselves. This would have meant they formed a strong and lasting friendship, which explains why Henry stuck by Joey's side for so long, despite his obnoxious behaviour. It also explains the war references on the posters and the fact that Henry has a wheelchair appear in his flashback at the end of chapter 1. The same wheelchair that shows up in Joey's apartment during the final moments of the story. This suggests Joey was perhaps injured during the war and so had to rely on the support of this chair in the years after. But like I said, this is just a theory, so let's move on to the formation of the studio itself. The most concrete information we have about the origins of Joey Drew Studios come from Henry's secret audio log found in chapter 3, in which he has this to say.
Only 2 weeks into this company and already it's gotten interesting. Joey is a man of ideas. And only ideas. When I agreed to start this whole thing with him, I thought there'd be a little more give and take. Instead I give, and he takes.
Henry tells us that he agreed to start the company with Joey, but it seems as though his good friend was a bit of a dictator from day one. We get the sense from this recording that Henry was the passionate animator and Joey Drew the money-hungry businessman. He certainly embraced this character arc as the story went on. We also garner a further key piece of information from this recording. Henry was Bendy's original creator. This is reinforced by the secret message at Henry's desk, which states he was born here, next to a rejected Bendy concept art. Most interestingly is how the story of Henry and Joey parallels that of the real-life account of Walt Disney and his partner, Iwerks. In this scenario, Joey Drew would symbolize Walt Disney, with Henry representing Iwerks. Walt had created an animation studio, which Ub worked at tirelessly before it went bankrupt and he moved back to his old job at a different animation studio. Eventually, Walt managed to open his own new company, Walt Disney Studios, and rehire his old friend and partner Ub Iwerks to get it off the ground. During this time, Ub put in an extraordinary amount of hours per month and worked tirelessly to help crank out cartoons on schedule. One of the characters he created alongside Walt Disney was the now famous Mickey Mouse, a character who would go on to represent the company. However, in the years that followed, tension grew between Walt and Ub, with Disney trying to take creative control away from Iwerks despite the fact he was doing most of the creative heavy lifting. This led to a disgruntled Ub breaking ties with his friend and business partner and leaving the studio and his creation Mickey Mouse behind. Sound familiar? This is exactly what I believe happened between Henry and Joey at his studio. After many months, years even, of working himself into the ground at the behest of his controlling friend Joey, Henry decided he wanted to have an easier life and spend more time with his family, the Linda mentioned in this recording.
I haven't even seen Linda for days now.
After all, we know Henry feels like the time he spent working with Joey was time wasted. But what happened next in the time after Henry turned his back on the studio? Well, the first thing Joey did, as we learned from Henry's remark at the beginning of Chapter 1, was to hire an entire team of animators to replace Henry. This was likely because Henry was both a highly talented animator, but also due to his friendship with Joey, was willing to work obscene hours constantly to keep the company on schedule. It is therefore unlikely that any other cartoonist would be willing to match this workload, and so Joey was forced to hire several animators to more fairly spread out the work, which is what he really should have done when Henry was still at the studio. By hiring these extra animators, costs would have gone up, and this was potentially the reason Joey started dreaming bigger than ever before. If his outgoings were to rise, then he wanted to make sure the company income was also increasing. So what did Joey do next to try and make all this extra money? Well, he increased the size of his studio for one. After all, we hear Henry mention this during the game.
Looks like they knocked out a wall or two after I left. Guess it took a few people to replace me.
By increasing the size of the studio, Joey would be able to ramp up production and churn out more and more cartoons. But to do this successfully, he would also want to create new characters. We saw this with the arrival of the bad guy trio, the Butcher Gang, but more notably with the creation of Bendy's female co-star, Alice Angel. However, Alice wasn't such a great hit, as we learn from an audio log featuring Sean Flynn, who worked on the toy production line.
And if he really wants to be so helpful, he could be telling me what I'm to be doing with this warehouse I got full of that angel whatchamacallit. Not a scrap of that mess, he said.
Toys and other Bendy-themed merchandise, such as Bacon Soup, were of course two other ways in which Joey Drew hoped to expand his empire. And with the expansion of his studio, it allowed him to create an entire toy workshop, meaning nothing had to be outsourced and all profit would go directly to Joey himself. It also meant that all expenses and profit loss would fall squarely at his feet too. And as we know from one of Joey's audio logs in Chapter 5 and the notice board in his apartment at the end of the game, these losses eventually led to the closure of his studio and Joey himself filing for bankruptcy. The shame of such a grand failure would weigh down hard on anybody, but especially an egomaniac like Joey. Joey was a proud man who seemed to have narcissistic tendencies, so this failure would have been mentally damaging for him and may have sent him off the rails and down a dark path. But before we get to that, let us turn our attention to Bendyland itself, the colossal wonder designed and built by BERTRUM Piedmont at Joey Drew's request. This was likely Joey's last-ditch effort to revive his dying Bendy brand and save his studio from closure. With the success of theme parks such as Disneyland, it seems logical to conclude Joey fancied a slice of that proverbial pie for himself. But we know Bendyland was yet another failed project, as we see a picture of it on Joey's notice board alongside some ticket stubs, which suggests it was built and open to the public at one point, but not for very long. an expense this great was the final nail in the coffin for Joey Drew Studios. And this impending doom led Joey to consult with the Gent Company and collaborate on a large-scale project to bring his cartoons to life.
Apparently Mr. Drew has another large project in mind now, and it ain't gonna be cheap.
Just imagine a theme park full of living cartoons, not simply men and women in suits, but actual real-life cartoon characters your kids could interact with. It would be a scientific marvel, and would have made Joey Drew a millionaire, saving Bendyland and his studio in the process. And so, the Ink Machine was born. But that's it for part 1 of the story of Joey Drew. Be sure to return for the second and final part of this twisted tale in the next few days, where we venture into the mind of Joey Drew and explore his darkest moments. Look at the creation of the Ink Machine, and what exactly happened to Henry and the other workers of the studio after their return.
There's something I need to show you.